in 2011 of May, rain saturated our ground, and heavy rain west of town sent water surging through the Musselshell. It hit the high water mark 2 feet above our previous high flood stage. It devastated homes and ranches and businesses in the communities of Roundup, Musselshell, and Melstone.
My name is Amanda Liggett, and I'm the pastor at Zion Lutheran in Roundup here. I'm also the president of the Roundup Ministerial Association and the Volunteer Emergency Operations Center coordinator for Musselshell County DES. One of the things that I've learned is that when you're dealing with disaster in a small town, you often have to wear several hats.
Actually, the flooding hit twice. It happened for 8 days, and then the waters receded. About 4 days later, the rain started again, and the floods came again, and we were reflooded for another 6 or 7 days. Altogether, we had 18 days of floods.
When the 2011 flood happened, I had been in Roundup for a couple of years, and we had a really great association going at that time. We had ministers who met every week for breakfast together. We supported one another in our struggles, and we prayed for one another. And so we knew and trusted one another very well. So when the flood came, my very first phone calls were to my fellow ministers here in town to say, what are we going to do? And it just sort of happened naturally. The Catholic Church is the largest church, and they're on Main Street, and they were so kind to throw wide their doors and welcome everyone in to do the work that needed done. Somebody painted the words "Rally Point" on this big piece of wood, and they put it out in front of the church, and by that night we had meals being served out of the basement of the Catholic Church. And it was a place that was natural for people to come and not only to get meals, but to look for help, to ask questions, to find out what was going on. And very shortly we had people coming in to give money, say, where can we give this? And that's something that we learned, that you need to have a place for people to donate when something goes on. And so we real quick set up a fund. People were coming in and dropping off, cash, checks, lots of different things. So we got a bank account ready and had to figure out how to handle that. And it was a really fast, hard lesson, and something that I wish that we could have thought about ahead of time. It would have been very helpful to have a plan in place for how to handle that money and how best to distribute it as well when the time came.
The Roundup Ministerial Association immediately rallied the churches and local individuals to begin feeding meals to the displaced survivors, to volunteers, and to the National Guard who came into the community to help. For 18 days, meals were served 3 times a day. This became a place where people could get information on the flood, what roads were open and closed. They could get donated items, food items, and meals and friendship.
So for the initial response to the disaster, the Ministerial Association really spearheaded things and was kind of the name that everyone in town knew to go to for what they needed. But we quickly realized that a bunch of pastors don't have all the skills you need to help people in the long term, talented as we are. But we knew we needed a bigger and more diverse group of people. And the Musselshell County Recovery Team became the vehicle for driving that forward in the long term. And what you'll learn as you go through a disaster is that there is a ton of energy at first, and that energy can start to flag. And so you need to find the people who can be in it for the long term with you and who care about the recovery of people in the months and sometimes years that it takes to get them back to a new normal.
Hi, my name is Monty. I'm a member of the MCRT, the Musselshell County Recovery Team. We work under a parent organization called the Musselshell Valley Community Foundation. We actually are sponsored by them, and they do the financial stuff for us and keep track of all of our funds for us. I was a board member of that parent corporation and was asked to be on the committee to work on this recovery effort that started with an event here in this particular part of the world. So the kind of work that I was asked to help with is to help with things like if we needed some grant writing, help with some publicity things, and actually then set up the structure of how we're going to respond financially to some of the things that will come about because of these disasters that we've had.
As the waters receded, it became evident that the destruction was widespread. Homes, bridges, ranches along the Musselshell were damaged beyond belief. In the initial assessment that was done by DES in the county and city, 109 homes had been affected by the floods, 22 had major destruction, and 2 were destroyed. Out of all that, only 11 homeowners had flood insurance to help them cover their expenses.
In this area, there's a group of ministers and priests and so forth, and they call it the Ministerial Association. And as this first disaster occurred, people started looking for a place to donate money to help the victims and resources to help the victims. And so they were donating it to the churches, through the churches, and the churches were providing services and meals and so forth. But it got to be so overwhelming to them that they came to the Community Foundation and says, can you help us form an organization that can deal with all these resources and keep it organized and get it delivered to the people that were really in need of the help? And so the Community Foundation started talking about how they were going to do that and formed this committee, which is what I was talking about, the MCRT, Musselshell County Recovery Team, and that's how we came into existence. The Ministerial Association, with all the funding and so forth they'd come through, still stayed involved, but they actually then had us take over the financial end of things and the logistics of getting it delivered.
The initial damage assessment had reached the threshold that allowed us to apply for federal declaration of disaster. This brought FEMA into the community to help with individuals and assistance. One of the important things that FEMA brought in was a liaison who met with us and told us some statistics that were rather startling. She said that for every day that we were in flood, you multiply that number by 10 to come up with the days that you would be in relief. And then you multiply that number by 10 to come up with the days that you would be in long-term recovery. She, along with other national organizations who were here to help and assist us, such as BOAD and UMCOR, suggested that we form a long-term recovery team in our community. We had 18 days in flood. Multiply that by 10, we had 180 days for the relief phase, and multiply that by 10, you have 1,800 days for long-term recovery, in which you're helping people get back, not to normal, but to a new normal for them.
One of the things that we learned that in retrospect is maybe a little bit obvious is that people who've been through a disaster, especially those who are directly impacted by the disaster, are going to go through some heavy emotions. And people who are in a volunteer capacity and trying to help need to be the non-anxious presence, as they taught us in clinical pastoral education. My advisor would be proud of me for remembering that term, but you need to be the non-anxious presence so that you remember that the fear and the anxiety and sometimes the anger that comes at you is not about you. And that will come out in the first couple of weeks as people are dealing directly with the disaster itself, but it will really come out in the long term as people realize that their lives maybe aren't going to be exactly the way that they were before. And so they need people who can kind of not be doormats for them, but can recognize that it's not about you.
One of the things that had to be done when we first got the legal things out of the way with the Community Foundation and forming this committee was find a way to get people trained up to go actually meet with the victims, do some sort of a needs assessment that's kind of standardized from one victim to the other so that we can deal with as an organization, and coordinate how we're going to respond with the federal agencies and the state agencies who are also trying to respond and trying to get their response on the ground. And so part of the challenge is to just do it so that it's user-friendly to the people here, and that we have people that know what to expect when they go meet with the victims of a disaster, because those people are in a little more different frame of mind than we're usually using. So it's an important thing that you actually understand what's going to be expected of you. And there's a lot of help out there to get that training put into place. And a lot of it comes through church organizations at the national level, actually. So there's a lot of opportunity for that, but it's a big need that gets done right away.
Our focus was on vulnerable populations, those who had no insurance, were elderly, disabled, families, or were at a poverty level before the crisis happened in their lives. The needs were immense, beginning with helping to muck out the mud that was in their homes, tearing out wallboard at least 4 feet up the walls in rooms that had been flooded, replacing furnaces and electric water heaters which had been damaged by the floods.
My name is Charlotte. I'm a member of the Musselshell County Recovery Team. I'm a board member and a case manager both. When disaster strikes in any community, as a member of that community, you want to help in any way possible. I started helping in the kitchens, serving the victims, the displaced home people, and also all the wonderful volunteers that came to help. When Musselshell County Recovery Team was first formed, we didn't know a lot, and it took us a while to get up and running. I became a case manager at that time. I would go to the homes and I would visit with the people and find out what their needs were. I would take those findings back to the board, and we would decide and discuss what needed to be done.
So when the person who was out, and the first responder who was out and met with and actually sometimes it was a team of 2 that went out, but when they came back and brought this case to the committee, we would actually assign case numbers on it because there was quite a few of them, so we had to actually keep it organized so we knew what we were doing. And then they would present what were the perceived needs from that person or that family. They would do it in some sort of a checklist form so that when we got it from one person versus another, we understood the thing similarly. And then the committee would sit and look at it and say, now look, we need to replace, for instance, I remember one of the places down here by the river after the flood of 2011, actually they had lost a bedroom on their house, and they had some quite a bit of water damage in the basement of the house. But the house appeared to be at least salvageable, and they needed to be cleaned up, and there needed maybe some treatment for mold. There needed to be materials pulled off the walls and stripped in the bedroom that they had lost so that the mold didn't grow. They would refurbish that room. They may put new studs in some areas. They would reinsulate it. It might have to be rewired. A lot of times we'd lose a water heater or something electrical. So we would either, if the people were capable of doing work themselves and replace that, in some instances we would allow that to happen. We'd just replace materials. But there were times when, you need an electrician to go down there and actually do the work because they're trained to do it, and it'll end up being proper under the codes and so forth. We also had a couple of volunteers from the community, and in fact hired a few people to go out and help maybe a second time assessment to say exactly what material or where they're going to need professional help in getting some of those things refurbished, do some foundation work, or pull all the carpets out and redo the floors, or fix the, and there were cases in between, because we're talking more than one instance here. We're talking floods in one instance, which is a certain kind of a loss, and then we're talking fires where it might have damaged the whole thing, and it might have damaged their property, or it might have lost septic tanks and so forth. So there are a lot of times when the people who have the loss did not have the expertise to go back and do any of the work themselves, so we had to deal with both types of losses. And I recall that the other thing is when you were looking at this, if you were looking at replacing a room, for instance, on a house because of a flood, then you had to have somebody go out and do some sort of a material list and an appraisal of what it's going to cost to do this replacement, so that you're not just putting money into something. You have to start lining up resources of folks who can do the work, who can estimate what it's going to take to do the work, and the people who will actually bring the material up for you, deliver it to the site where it is, go out and inspect, see that when the work is done, that it's done properly. A lot of the times we struggled as a committee with how far do we go for recovery? Do we replace what was there? Do we make it better than what was there? Do we make it only as far as our money will go before we even take it on? I mean, there's a lot of questions that you run into when you have a whole lot of cases in front of you. And it makes it kind of an interesting practice to set and think, now how far can we bring this person? Are we going to make their life better? We're going to make their home better than it was originally? Is that our mission? And so some of those discussions you'll actually end up with. And overall, because of the limitations on the funds that there are, we kind of took it on that let's try to get it at least to back as good as the conditions were before the disaster. And secondly, make sure whatever we do would meet the standards of what the industry would say you need to be doing. And that's kind of the basis of how we made those decisions.
But as Montanans, we all know that we're a pretty hardy bunch and pretty self-sufficient. A delicate balance had to be found.
I would make the observations with each client. Even though they suffered the same disaster, each one was different in their needs and what they wanted. I would take these observations back to the board, and it was good to have different members on the board, such as handymen and construction workers that knew about buildings and rebuilding after a disaster. They kept us case managers from getting too emotionally involved. This way we could help the clients rebuild in an orderly manner without us wasting our time or resources. Us case managers also kept the board members from becoming too unemotionally detached. We balanced each other out, and we worked well together because we knew that we wanted the best for everyone.
The Musselshell Valley Community Foundation, as a 501c3, was able to apply for grant dollars to national disaster organizations, which brought in funds to fund a part-time volunteer assistant who would coordinate the effort between those who wanted to come in and help the community and what the needs of the survivors were.
It took a lot to get to the smooth stage of running the long-term recovery team and working with each client. But that's because we didn't know to be prepared in advance. A year after the floods, we were sitting around talking about maybe we could start meeting once a year instead of once a month, just to keep the team together and awareness raised. But that's when disaster struck again.
The day of the fire, I was coming home from Billings. My husband and I live south of Roundup, which is where the fire happened. And I looked up and saw this plume of smoke. And it was kind of small and somewhat inconsequential at that point. And I went home and I walked up the hill and I stood in that horrible driving wind with it was blowing so hard that the sand hurt when it hit your bare skin. And I watched as that plume of smoke got bigger and bigger and blacker and blacker, and it was absolutely horrifying. My husband came home that night about 6 o'clock, and he said that he saw some friends of ours go by and realized that they were rushing home to evacuate. People had so little time to get out, and I really am grateful to our emergency responders who were able to warn people to have an evacuation in those horrible circumstances. And people were able to get out, but they didn't have time to grab much. And we got in our car that evening and sped down the highway to try and get to our friend's house, to try and help them evacuate if we could. But we got to where the Brandon Iron is, and it was we got there just as the fire was beginning to cross the road. And we were watching flames leaping through the trees. It was insane. There were horses on the highway as people were trying to get them out. And we got turned back at that point, and we couldn't get to where our friend's place was to help them evacuate. And it's sort of amazing, the thought of having just a few minutes to grab what you need. And it's easy to look at that and say, well, you know, it's just things. But people's lives were changed. And I'll never forget the look on our deputy's face as he would have to call people to tell them that their homes were simply gone. And it's emotionally taxing for everyone. And it's important to remember that that is going to be one of the most difficult things people can go through.
And we had fires where we lost at least 72 homes and a lot of outbuildings. It was much easier this time to help the clients because we were already up and running. We knew what needed to be done, and we knew what would happen. This is a very important thing to know and to be prepared for. You can never be prepared for disasters. They're different each and every time they happen, even if it's the same disaster that happens over and over again. But we made it through.
The Musselshell County Recovery Team consists of 3 members from the faith community, 3 from the Musselshell Valley Community Foundation, 3 from the business community, and 5 at large from throughout the county.
You know, it was actually a real honor to get to serve on the committee with these people, because there's quite a variety of folks there. There's people who are, you know, maybe a little more structured in the way they do business, and there's people with big hearts that are they just want to help everybody, and we learn from each other by kind of talking these things out and looking at what the need is and understanding how that person's probably thinking that we're trying to help. And the bottom line is we're actually able, because we get to hear different ways of thinking about things, to actually probably be a little more effective how we get it on the ground and how we help people. I think it also lends to the credibility of the organization for the people that are donating money, that you actually have a good mix of community folks with a lot of experience and a lot of probably discussion amongst the group, saying, yeah, here's how we want to deliver it, and get it done in a reasonable amount of time, and just keep it so that we actually accomplish what we're here for, and that was to help the people.
Beyond the structural foundations that we had to create of forming bylaws, a mission statement, and officers, one of our first major tasks was to train volunteer case managers to go out and help the survivors. Community churches also stepped in 3 or 4 times a week to provide a hot meal to the volunteers in the evening. The part-time staff person was invaluable in continuing the communication with the survivors and with helping to coordinate outside groups from all over the country, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Colorado, and Seattle, who were willing to come in and help with the flood recovery. By December of 2011, the Musselshell County Recovery Team was down to monthly meetings. By May of the following year, 2012, a local church sponsored a barbecue, a gathering for survivors and volunteers to gather together on the anniversary of the original flood. We were breathing a sigh of relief. We were in no danger of flooding, and the Musselshell County Recovery Team was down to 2 clients who we were working with. Unfortunately, that feeling of relief did not last long. At the end of June, a wildfire caused by lightning with temperatures of over 100 degrees and winds in excess of 60 miles an hour started a wildfire that burned through the Bull Mountains, destroying everything in its path. In the course of 6 or 7 hours, 72 homes were destroyed and 230 additional structures, barns, garages, vehicles were destroyed or damaged. Once again, our community, rallied by the churches, began to feed and help our neighbors who had lost so much. MCRT, with their fresh experience of long-term recovery, was able to help gear up immediately to help those who were in most need of assistance.
Our first disaster, it was difficult and we were unsure of ourselves. We were blindly just doing what we needed to do. We weren't sure what to do and how much we could help. Our second disaster went much smoother. We were more efficient and able to help the clients faster and better.
As one of our members on MCRT remarked, flood and fire are such different disasters. A flood survivor stands in his living room in mud, despairing of the long hours and work ahead of him. A fire survivor has no living room to stand in. Everything is gone, just gone. A flood survivor runs to check the river gauges every time it rains for more than a half hour. But a fire survivor has instant anxiety whenever a storm passes over or smoke or high winds come on in the late afternoon. With the Doll fire, the losses did not reach the threshold for federal assistance to come in as a federally declared disaster. But donations poured in from individuals, businesses, and organizations locally, throughout the region, and across the nation. The fire happened on June 26th. By July 8th, fire survivors were registering with DES, Red Cross, and MCRT for much-needed immediate assistance. Case managers were quickly retrained, and assistance was able to come within weeks now instead of months that it had taken following the flood. By November, MCRT was able to organize a Blue Christmas for the fire survivors. They received gifts of haircut coupons, turkeys, tools for their homes, anything that would help them in their recovery. These were donated by local businesses and businesses from Billings. Long-term recovery takes a long time. Our last flood survivor finished with us at the end of 2014, and we have one fire case that we are still working with at this time. One more thought and consideration to give. We call it the tsunami of clothes. It happened when so many generous people donated clothing and household items. But the problem is storing them, sorting them, and being able to disperse them in a manner that honors both the recipient and the donor.
I would say that the biggest lesson we learned is that you never ask for donations of clothing. Ever. There was one point where, I believe we moved the clothing about 4 times, and there was one point where we had it in a downtown building that had 15-foot ceilings, and we had bags of clothes stacked to the ceiling, and I joked that the next disaster would be an avalanche of clothing. People are incredibly generous, and they will come out of the woodwork and give whatever you can ask them to give. And especially in those first couple of weeks, I think my line was always that there's always more room in the bank account. We have plenty of storage there. So raise what you can, especially in those first couple of weeks, because you will need every penny to help people. We had 72 homes burn in the fire, and many of them were not insured, and they needed our help. And we had to be as frugal as we possibly could, and we did everything we could to make sure we used it wisely. And luckily by then we had a reputation for using it wisely. And so if you can build that reputation and that trust in the beginning, then you're going to do well.
Roundup and Musselshell County came together to help the survivors of the 2 disasters that we experienced. And every county needs to be prepared and ready to help in the eventuality of a disaster in their area.
You know, I really recommend that in communities around the area that they put together some sort of a committee. They talk to people in the community they think that would be interested in working together, and possibly different experience on the team members and different ways of looking at things, and get them together and actually set up and meet together and figure out how you can get your organization formed and just be more prepared. Because the one thing that we learned really quick on the first one was we weren't very prepared, because these disasters happen and you don't get to plan for the disaster to happen. But we also learned that after we got it done on the first one, and as it evolves to the next disaster, the preparedness cuts the time frame down to help people tremendously, and actually gets the community more mobilized quicker, saying, well, that group's already formed, here's where I'm sending my money, here's how I want it to be used, and we actually have a chance to put it on the ground and help folks right away. And in between times, perhaps it's not a very glorious committee, because it's kind of boring when there's no disasters if you're a disaster response committee. But the fact that you're actually prepared to be there, and legally you've got things in place, you don't have to go searching for what are we going to do when this happens to us. It's kind of there and it's ready to go. You'll see that the community will be very grateful for that. It'll be a real nice thing to have in place if you ever have a disaster in your area.
We encourage communities to give some forethought as to how they can be prepared for disasters. Where will you feed and house your survivors? How will you manage volunteers who come in? And what resources are available for the long-term recovery in your community that you might need?
In helping one of my clients, my most poignant memory was helping them clean out their basement full of water. I remember seeing her favorite Christmas items that she had saved over the years and from her children floating in this dirty, ugly muck. We were able to save some of them, and later, as I was sitting out on her lawn with a bucket of water cleaning her dishes and her favorite ornaments that she was able to save, she was telling me stories of each piece, reliving her past and trying to move forward. She talked about this one plate that I was cleaning, and it was kind of falling apart because it was a favorite craft item of hers where she had decoupaged pretty paper napkins over it. When I first saw it, I thought it was a beautiful plate, but as I started washing it, it fell apart. This made me think about what can we hold on to from the past and what can we look forward to in the future. How can we move from disaster to the rest of our lives? What can we save and what can we keep?
Any community can be hit at any time by natural disasters. It's important to be looking ahead and realize you need to know what resources you have locally and what resources are out there for you to utilize. Think of local 501c3s who could sponsor the groups that are coming from out of state, especially those who are federals, like the AmeriCorps and the Montana Conservation Corps, to help in the recovery. But the most important asset we have is our people, our community. Disasters happen locally, and they can go up to a state or federal level, but they always come back to the local level. And that is where the people get their most help, is in the local community. So we encourage you to invest locally in your people, in your community. Be prepared for the next disaster that may strike your community.
So I would encourage you to be thinking about and finding the people that you need to form a team of people that have various skills, because you'll need them all, in order to have that in place before a disaster. Things will go so much more smoothly if you can think about these things ahead of time, and your community will be much more prepared. I'm grateful for our community. The way that they came together was incredible, and the Ministerial Association kind of got a lot of credit, but really it's about the people that came and did the work. And we couldn't have done what we did without that coming together. We had a good cohesion before we started, but the truth is that we are a lot stronger as a community now than we were before our first disaster. And that makes us more ready for anything that might come next.